The sun in Sao Paulo felt more relentless that day. Levka, running through the busy streets downtown, could feel the sweat running down his face, soaking his shirt as his backpack swung on his back. Late again, he ignored the irritated glances from pedestrians as he stumbled or bumped into someone by mistake. Every minute lost was a sentence of reproach at the temporary job he could barely hold on to. But at that moment, an even greater urgency surfaced. A sound. Faint. High-pitched. Levka stopped, his chest heaving, and looked around. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him after all. His head felt like it was about to explode from the mix of heat and stress. But there it was again, the muffled cry. He turned his neck until his eyes locked on a car parked beside the sidewalk, partially hidden in the shade of a tree. The vehicle was closed, but inside something was moving. Levka approached, his heart racing, and saw the impossible. A baby. His eyes widened as he noticed the child was red, her face wet and twisted in desperate crying. Instinctively, Levka tried to open the door, but it was locked. He knocked on the window forcefully, hoping someone would come to open it, but the street was strangely empty. "Damn, damn, damn," he whispered, running trembling hands through his hair. The heat inside the car was suffocating, even from the outside. He knew what he had to do, but fear paralyzed him. Break a window? What if he was accused of theft? What if he hurt the baby? However, the anguished cry cut through his thoughts like a knife. There was no choice. He took off his jacket, wrapped it around his fist, and struck the side window with all his strength. The first attempt failed, but he didn't stop. On the second hit, the glass shattered, sending fragments across the seat. The noise echoed down the street, but Levka didn't care. Carefully, he reached for the baby, who was strapped into a car seat, crying nonstop. His hands shook as he undid the fastenings. When he finally picked her up, the heat radiating from her small body nearly made him cry. The child was burning with fever, and her crying grew weaker by the second. He wrapped the baby in his jacket, creating a barrier against the scorching heat, and began running. The journey to the hospital felt endless. Each step was a struggle against exhaustion and growing fear. What if I don't make it in time? He thought, as the weak cry of the child made his mind race faster than his legs. "Hang on, please. Don't give up, little one," he whispered, his voice choked. The image of the fragile child in his arms brought uncomfortable memories. He saw himself, years ago, in an orphanage, waiting for someone who never came. The feeling of helplessness that he knew so well now seemed to manifest in the small being he was holding. Finally, the hospital appeared on the horizon. With a desperate shout, Levka rushed through the entrance, drawing the attention of everyone around. "I need help. This baby was trapped in a car," he cried. Nurses and doctors ran to him, taking the baby from his arms. One of them looked at Levka, noticing his condition, almost as exhausted as the child. "Are you okay?" she asked, but Levka simply nodded, focusing on the baby being taken into the emergency room. He collapsed into a chair, sweat running down his forehead, his arms heavy. For a few moments, the world was silent until a hurried figure appeared in the hallway. A woman in a white coat stopped abruptly when she saw the baby being carried. She put her hands to her mouth, a sob escaping her lips. "My God, it's my son," she exclaimed, running after the stretcher. Levka felt the floor disappear beneath him. The words "my son" echoed in his mind, leaving him disoriented. He watched as the woman, tears in her eyes, held the baby's tiny hand before the doctors took him for evaluation. Moments later, the same woman, still trembling, returned to the hallway. Her eyes met Levka's, who remained still. She approached, and her voice, though choked, sounded clear. "Was it you? Did you save my baby?" Levka opened his mouth to answer, but the words didn't come. He just nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and surprise. To his surprise, she pulled him into a tight hug. He felt her tears soak his shoulder, and for a moment, the two shared the weight of what had happened. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice faltering. "You saved my son's life. And mine too." The emotions flooding Levka's heart left him breathless. He barely knew that this moment, filled with chaos and redemption, would change the course of his life forever. The hospital waiting room was a sea of silence, interrupted only by the occasional sound of hurried footsteps and murmurs between the staff. Levka, still seated in the stiff plastic chair, barely noticed the comings and goings around him. The shock of what had just happened reverberated through his body like an endless echo. What should have been an ordinary day had turned into something incomprehensible. He raised his gaze when the doctor returned to the hallway. Dr. Irina seemed more composed now, although her eyes were still red from crying. The white coat seemed a cruel contrast to the vulnerability in her expression. She was holding the baby in her arms, now calm, wrapped in a light blue blanket provided by the hospital. "He's fine," she announced with a shaky sigh. "Thanks to you." Her words seemed to break a dam inside Levka. He tried to stand up, but his legs felt like lead. Still, he mumbled, I just did what anyone would do." She approached him, shaking her head slowly. "No, you did much more. You broke a car window, raced against time. You saved my son's life." The weight of the statement made her shudder. Irina took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm a doctor, but today, I failed. It was my fault. All of this was my fault." Levka saw the tears return to her eyes as her voice began to falter. She pressed the baby against her chest, as if needing to prove to herself that he was still there. "I was late for an emergency surgery. His father was supposed to pick up the baby, but there was a mix-up. When I realized what had happened, I thought I would never see him again." Her words came quickly, filled with guilt and despair. "You can't imagine what it's like to almost lose what you love most." Levka didn't know what to say. Her words brought up his own dark memories, a pain he rarely let surface. He knew, yes, what it was like to lose something. He knew what it felt like to be powerless, at the mercy of forces larger than himself. "You're very brave, you know," Irina continued, interrupting his thoughts. "Not everyone would have done what you did." She sat down beside Levka, still holding the baby carefully. For a moment, they sat in silence, united by the gravity of what had happened. Then Irina turned to him with a serious expression. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice now softer. "Levka." "Levka Andrade," he answered, almost whispering. "Levka," she repeated, as if savoring the sound of the name. "You have something rare, something you can't learn. Empathy, courage, humanity. These are qualities few people have, especially in moments of crisis." He looked away, feeling uncomfortable with the compliment, but she continued, "Have you ever thought about working in something that involves taking care of people?" "Medicine, maybe?" Levka laughed nervously. "Me? A doctor? No, I didn't even finish college. I work odd jobs to help my mom at home." Irina furrowed her brow, studying him for a moment. "That doesn't mean you can't. Look, I know it seems impossible now, but you have what it takes. And if you're willing to try, I can help." Levka blinked, confused. "Help? What do you mean?" She smiled, though there was still a hint of sadness in her expression. "I can help you get into medical school. I have connections. access to scholarship programs. But the most important thing is that you have to believe you can do it. Because, Levka, you have something many doctors forget along the way. Heart. Levka couldn't respond immediately. The offer felt surreal. Him, a young man who could barely pay the bills at home, becoming a doctor. Irina's words planted a seed of hope, but also of fear. He wasn't sure if he was capable of facing something so huge. I don't know. I don't know if I'm good enough for this, he murmured, more to himself than to her. What you did today proves that you're more than good enough. Irina's voice was firm. You don't have to decide now. But think about it, please. Promise me you'll think about it. Levka nodded slowly, though the whirlwind in his mind made it impossible to imagine any scenario where that could be possible. And Levka, thank you. Not just for saving my son, but for reminding me of what really matters in this profession. I'll never forget what you did. She held his hand for a moment before standing up. He watched her walk away down the hallway, still holding the baby with the utmost care. When she disappeared from view, Levka was left alone with his thoughts. The day had started like any other, but it was ending with his life turned upside down. He had saved a life, but could he change his own? Dr. Irina's words echoed in Levka's mind for days. Every time he sat down to organize his thoughts, the image of the baby in his arms and Irina's firm yet hopeful tone came back to him like an invisible current, pulling him forward. Becoming a doctor. The idea seemed as absurd as it was tempting. The morning after this whirlwind of thoughts, Levka was at home, helping his mother fold freshly washed clothes. The smell of soap mixed with the strong aroma of coffee filled the small apartment where they lived. His mother, Irina, a strong and resilient woman, had eyes that always seemed to know more than they let on. She immediately noticed that something was different about her son. "You're too quiet today, my son," she commented, folding a towel and giving him a keen look. "What's going on?" Levka hesitated, but knew he couldn't keep it to himself. He placed the T-shirt he was holding on the table and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. "Mom, do you remember the baby I saved?" He began, his voice calm but with an underlying tension. She nodded, encouraging him to continue. "His mother, she's a doctor. And she offered me a chance to study medicine." Levka's mother's eyes widened, clearly surprised. She sat in silence for a moment, as if processing what she had just heard. Finally, she put the towel aside and sat down beside him. "Medicine," she repeated, a mixture of astonishment and pride in her voice. "But, Levka, that's a hard path. It's expensive, and you already work so hard to help us. I know, Mom." He ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. "That's exactly why I don't know if I should accept. It's already tough now. Imagine with college, work, bills. I don't want to put more weight on you." She reached out, holding his hand firmly, forcing him to look into her eyes. "Listen, my son. Since you were little, you've always cared about others. You have a heart bigger than this world. If there's anyone who can face this challenge, it's you." She squeezed his hand, her eyes welling up. "Don't think about me. I'll manage. Think about what you can do with this opportunity. Think about the future you can build." Her words penetrated deep into Levka's heart. He felt a lump in his throat, but smiled faintly, with determination beginning to grow. For the first time, he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could face this challenge. The next afternoon, he returned to the hospital. His hands were sweaty as he climbed the stairs to the main entrance. The fear of the unknown was still there, but now there was something stronger, curiosity about what might be. He found Dr. Irina in her office, reviewing medical records with impressive concentration. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile. "Levka, I didn't expect to see you so soon." She closed the file and invited him to sit. "Have you thought about what we talked about?" Levka took a deep breath before responding. "Yes, I thought about it. And I want to try." He looked directly at her, trying to hide his anxiety. "But I'll be honest. I don't know if I'm capable. I was never good with studies, and the idea of getting into medical school seems impossible." Irina leaned forward, her gaze full of determination. "Impossible is a dangerous word, Levka. I've seen people face much bigger adversities and triumph. You have what it takes, but you'll need to work hard. And if you are willing to do that, I'll be here to help you every step of the way." She explained the process, how he would need to take a preparatory course to catch up on his academic foundation, how she could help him with recommendations and even initial financial support. Levka listened attentively, his heart oscillating between fear and excitement. Before he left, Irina said something that stayed with him. "Medicine is not just about saving lives. It's about understanding people, their pains, their fears. And that, Levka, is something you already do better than most." The following weeks were a trial by fire. Levka enrolled in a night preparatory course while continuing to work during the day. The workload was exhausting, and he often wondered if he was pushing himself too hard. But whenever doubt crept in, he remembered his mother's words and the faith Dr. Irina had in him. One night, after an especially difficult class, he found a note from his mother on the table. It was simple but powerful. "Never give up, my son. You were born to make a difference." Those words were all he needed to keep going. And step by step, Levka began to see that the impossible might not be as out of reach as it seemed. The sound of the alarm clock echoed through the small apartment, cutting through the silence of the early morning. Levka opened his eyes, feeling the weight of many sleepless nights piling up. It had been 2 months since he started the preparatory course for medical school, and his routine had become a whirlwind of studying, working, and family responsibilities. He dragged himself into the kitchen where his mother was already awake, preparing a strong coffee. "You should rest more, my son," she said, pushing a mug in his direction. Her tone was gentle but worried. "I can't, Mum. I need to keep the pace." He smiled, trying to look confident, but the exhaustion was evident on his face. "Just a few more months, and I can focus on the exam." Despite the fatigue, Levka felt something new: purpose. Every class was a chance to push beyond the limits he once thought he had. Math and chemistry, his biggest struggles, now took up much of his nights, while the early mornings were reserved for reviewing biology and anatomy. The weight of the books in his backpack mirrored the weight on his mind. At work, things weren't any easier. He kept his job as a delivery driver, running through the streets of São Paulo to help support his mother. One particularly hot afternoon, while climbing 3 flights of stairs to deliver a package, he felt the impact of his routine on his body. A sudden dizziness made him lean against the wall. "Are you okay?" asked the client, an older man, as he took the package. Levka nodded, forcing a smile. "Just the heat, sir. Nothing serious," but he knew it was more than that. His body was at its limit, and the balance between work and study was starting to feel unsustainable. However, quitting had never been an option. In the preparatory classes, Levka found an unexpected support network. Among his classmates, there were others who carried stories of overcoming their own struggles. One of them was Lara, a young woman with a quick speech and impressive intelligence. She always sat at the front of the class and somehow managed to absorb everything the teacher said. "Hey, you seem to be struggling with the chemistry part," she said one evening after class. "Do you want to study together? I can show you some tips Levka hesitated. He didn't want to admit that he needed help, but Lara's tone was more encouraging than condescending. "I'd appreciate it. Thanks." He smiled, relieved that he wasn't facing everything alone. The study sessions with Lara became frequent, and the friendship that blossomed was one of the few light moments in his routine. They shared jokes about the teachers, study strategies, and occasionally their own insecurities. "You know you're capable, right?" Lara said one night as they reviewed a scribbled periodic table. "I can see it in the way you talk about people, the care you have. That's something you can't teach." Her words echoed those of Dr. Irina, reinforcing something Levka was still learning to believe. He had more than just courage. He had a calling. The first big test of the course came too quickly. The room was full, and the sound of papers flipping added to the rising anxiety. Levka stared at the exam, feeling the sweat on his palms. The chemistry formulas and biology concepts seemed to dance in his mind, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself why he was there. "Let's go. It's just another fight," he muttered to himself, picking up his pencil. The weeks of intense studying paid off. While he didn't get the highest score, Levka managed a result above average, enough to reignite his confidence. As he walked out of the room, Lara was waiting for him with a smile. "I knew you'd do well. Now just keep going." Levka laughed, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. But he knew the biggest challenge was still ahead. One night, while reviewing his notes, he received an unexpected call. It was Dr. Irina. "Levka, sorry for calling so late," she began, her voice tired but calm. "I just wanted to check in on you. I've been following your progress in the course, and I know it hasn't been easy." Levka felt warmth in his chest at hearing the genuine concern in her voice. "I'm doing my best, Dr. Irina. I won't lie, it's been tough, but I feel like I'm on the right path." She paused before responding. "You are, Levka. I always knew it. Just remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you need anything at all, I'll be here." The call ended, but her words stayed with him. She believed in him, and that made all the difference. The following days brought new challenges, but also new victories. Levka learned to manage his time better, trust his instincts more, and accept help when necessary. Every step, no matter how small, was a triumph. As he looked out the window of his small room that night, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem like an impossible road. It felt like a mountain, difficult to climb, but with a view that he knew would be worth reaching. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hospital corridor echoed like a chaotic beat as Levka adjusted his posture. It was his first week as a volunteer intern in the emergency department of a hospital, one of the requirements for preparing for the medical school entrance exam. He was there more to observe and learn, but the intensity of the environment was overwhelming. Patients came in nonstop, and the voices of doctors, nurses, and anxious relatives blended together, creating a frantic symphony. Dr. Irina, who had facilitated his internship, rushed past him like a whirlwind, holding a clipboard. "Levka, stay alert. The emergency room is where life changes in seconds. Observe everything," she said, making brief eye contact before being called to another case. He nodded, but his hands were sweating from nerves. Despite being there only as an observer, he felt the weight of every decision made around him. This place was not for the faint of heart. Soon after, the calm was shattered by a dramatic entry. A medical team pushed in a stretcher with a middle-aged man, his face pale and covered in sweat, while a nurse shouted out the patient's condition. Man, 52 years old, suspected acute myocardial infarction. Weak pulse, unstable blood pressure. Levka froze, his heart racing. He stepped aside, trying not to interfere with the team, but something about the scene pulled him forward. The patient looked terrified, his eyes searching for something or someone in the chaos. Suddenly, "Doctor." Irina's voice echoed through the room. "Levka," she called, adjusting the patient's equipment. "I need you." Grab the pulse oximeter and attach it to his finger. "Hurry." Without thinking, Levka moved forward. His hands were shaking as he searched for the device, but he found the oximeter on the counter. He attached it to the patient's finger, trying his best not to show the panic he felt. The man looked at him, his eyes filled with fear. "It'll be okay, sir. We're taking care of you," Levka said, trying to sound confident, though uncertainty consumed him. The monitor began beeping, and Irina shot a glance at Levka. "Good job. Now step back, but keep observing. Pay attention to what we're doing here." He obeyed, stepping back, but his attention was fully fixed on the doctors. Irina and the team worked in unison, stabilizing the patient with impressive speed. Decisions were made in seconds, and every action seemed calculated to save that life. When the patient was finally stabilized and moved to the ICU, Irina turned to Levka. "Are you okay?" she asked, looking at him closely. Levka nodded, but his mind was racing. "I've never seen something like that so up close." It was terrifying. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes full of understanding. "It's normal to feel that way. Medicine is not just science, it's dealing with life in its most vulnerable state. But you did well today. You kept your composure when it mattered." He smiled, a little hesitantly, but felt a wave of relief with her words. In the following weeks, Levka was exposed to more intense situations. He learned how empathy made a difference in patient care. On one such occasion, an elderly woman arrived with an arm injury. While waiting for the evaluation, she seemed distressed, murmuring about how her children were worried about her. "I'll let them know you're okay, Mrs. Vera," Levka said, picking up the phone beside her. He dialed the number she provided, and the relieved smile that lit up the elderly woman's face touched him deeply. "You're an angel, my son," she said, squeezing his hand. "You're not a doctor yet, but you already have the heart of one." Those words stayed with him, fueling his determination to continue. Each patient, each story, reminded him of why he was there. It wasn't just about learning medical techniques, it was about being present, connecting with people. But the real trial came during a night shift when an 8-year-old boy was brought in with a high fever and difficulty breathing. The parents were frantic, and the medical team worked quickly to stabilize him. Amid the chaos, Irina asked Levka to prepare the materials for a blood sample. "You've seen how it's done, right? Just stay calm." He nodded, focusing on the task at hand. As he prepared everything, he felt the pressure build. The child's rapid breathing and the mother's sobs beside him made his confidence waver for a moment, but he forced himself to remember Irina's words, observe everything, stay focused. When everything was ready, he handed the materials to the nurse, who smiled and thanked him. After the boy was stabilized and moved to pediatrics, Irina approached him. "See, Levka, even in the small actions, you're part of something bigger. Never underestimate that." He took a deep breath, allowing himself to feel proud for the first time in a long time. That night, as he walked home, Levka reflected on everything he had learned. Each moment, each person, reinforced the certainty that he was on the right path. The mountain was still high, but now he knew he had the strength to climb it. He just needed to keep going, one step at a time. The big day had finally arrived. The graduation ceremony was about to begin, and the auditorium at the medical school campus was packed. Familiar and unfamiliar faces filled the space, but for Levka, only a few mattered. His mother, sitting in the front row, her radiant smile and teary eyes, and Dr. Irina, whose expression mixed pride and emotion. Both had been essential pillars in his journey, and he knew he wouldn't be there without them. Levka took a deep breath as he adjusted the lab coat he now wore with the utmost pride. His thoughts drifted back to the beginning of his journey, the baby trapped in the car, the decision to break the window, the sleepless nights balancing work and study. Each moment felt distant, but still pulsed with intensity in his memory. "Ready, Lara?" his friend and classmate asked, appearing beside him. She wore the same white coat and held the graduation cap with trembling hands. "I don't think I'll ever be fully ready," he replied, with a smile. "But that's never stopped me before." Lara laughed, though there were tears in her eyes. "You deserve this, Levka. We all know how hard you fought to get here." The ceremony began, and the initial speeches were made by professors and deans. When it came time for Levka to receive his diploma, he felt the palms of his hands sweat. He walked up to the stage and received the document from the director's hands. Applause filled the room, and he bowed briefly before returning to his seat. But his true moment of fulfillment was yet to come. After all the graduates had received their diplomas, the microphone was passed to Levka. He had been chosen to give the final speech, an honor he never imagined receiving. Levka walked to the podium, his heart racing. He looked out at the audience, where his mother discreetly wiped away her tears, and Irina watched him with a sparkle in her eyes. He took a deep breath and began. "If someone had told me a few years ago that I would be here today, I wouldn't have believed it. I grew up in an environment where dreams seemed to be reserved for other people. My life was made up of obligations and responsibilities. And to be honest, I never considered myself extraordinary." The room fell silent, each of his words echoing with weight and emotion. But sometimes life places us in unexpected situations. And these situations test us, shape us, and show us something we've never seen in ourselves. In my case, it was a baby trapped in a car under the scorching heat. He paused, letting the memory resurface. In that moment, I just wanted to save him. I had no idea that decision would change everything. He looked at Irina, who smiled and gave him a subtle nod. Throughout this journey, I've learned that being a doctor is not just about saving lives. It's about understanding the stories of each person who enters our clinic or the emergency room. It's about looking beyond the symptoms and seeing the human being. And I owe this to everyone who has been with me on this path, my teachers, my friends, and of course, my mother and Dr. Irina, who believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. Levka paused, allowing his words to be absorbed. Today, as we put on our white coats and receive our diplomas, we become more than doctors. We become guardians of lives and stories. I hope we never forget what it means to be here. And I hope that, just as many open doors for me, we can open doors for others who also don't believe it's possible. He finished with an emotional smile and a bow to the audience. The applause was thunderous, filling the auditorium with vibrant energy. Levka stepped off the stage with a mixture of relief and gratitude, feeling that he had closed this chapter of his life perfectly. After the ceremony, Irina found him in the crowd. She embraced him tightly, as if trying to convey everything she felt without words. When they pulled away, she smiled. "You're living proof that courage and empathy can transform lives. And not just yours." She looked around, as if indicating everyone there. "I'm so proud of you, Levka." His mother also approached, wrapping him in a warm embrace. "My son, you've not only changed your life, but mine as well. You've shown me that nothing is impossible." Levka held the hands of the two women who had supported him the most. He felt complete, fulfilled. But at the same time, he knew this was just the beginning. Later that night, As he walked down the street toward his apartment, Levka looked up at the starry sky. He couldn't help but smile as it spread across his face. The future seemed full of possibilities, and he was ready to embrace them. He knew there would be challenges ahead: sleepless nights, tough decisions, life and death situations. But with each step he took, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be. That night, for the first time in a long time, Levka slept deeply, knowing he had found not only his profession, but his purpose. This story touched you? If so, don't forget to like this video and share your emotions in the comments. We want to know which part inspired you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories that make us believe in the power of choices. Your participation truly makes a difference.